Hello and welcome to the HUK podcast. My name is Rabbi Moshe Friedman. I'm here with Rabbi Kayser, and we're excited to be having today a discussion about spirituality in the 21st century, spirituality as it relates to Judaism, and a discussion of all things about that. Rabbi Ari, let's start with you. Maybe we should discuss how we both became interested in the concept of spirituality. Maybe you can tell us a little bit something about how you became interested in this.
Well, yeah, we've had this conversation many times, so I just wanted to say how grateful I am that we get to do this now in front of our audience. And, for me, spirituality is a very, very important part of my life. And I'll tell you why, because, I grew up in a world that for me was very superficial, materialistic, and I felt that the world was kind of happening around me at such a pace that you end up disillusioned with the whole world and the whole system that you're being sold. And I remember having this experience when I was about 17, that the whole world was trying to sell me something, that you have to have this job, you have to do this in school, you have to, drive this car and have these relationships and go to these places and have these holidays. And I felt very strongly that was this, I was being sold something that was a lie. And I took that with me wherever I went, and I was like, hey, those things don't really make me happy, And
how did you know, by the way? It's because you had the car and you had the vacation?
Well, at different stages in my life, yes, I had different things, but it was more about experimentation. Through my adolescence, there was a lot of experimentation in many different things, and in various ways. I felt like the universe was trying to communicate something with me. And that was, before I was, a practicing religious Jew. I was someone who felt very strongly that I was being sold a lie. And that kind of came with a very, very strong sense of disillusionment, which is where I ended up taking that sense of disillusionment and going on a journey. And like so many young people, when I was 18, I went backpacking across the world. I started my journey in India and Southeast Asia and various other parts of the world.
Like a good Jewish boy always does.
Like a good Jewish boy. And the funny thing is that, there's the cliche that you have to go far away in order to find yourself. But I think that all cliches, and this is a really important thing, all cliches have some kind of sense or source of truth in them.
Well, that's absolutely true. There's some sort of archetype of what it is that we do, the journey that we go on. There's that book by Campbell, right? The Hero with a Thousand Faces, that was written in the 1950s, where this man basically said that there's one hero's journey that almost every story follows. And we're just reliving that journey over and over again. So the fact that it's cliched almost means that it's true.
I certainly agree with that. And, on a Jewish note, I think that all the stories of the Bible, especially of the stories in Genesis, they are all those archetypal stories. And that's why so many people relate specifically to the book of Genesis, because those stories are ones that span almost every element of human experience. And that's why so many people connect to them.
So, okay, you started with disillusionment and feeling like there was superficiality and there was a lie being sold to you, and then you kind of went off on your journey. Did the moment of clarity, did that negate what you had been experiencing before? Was it at odds with the previous life, or was it something wholly different?
Well, I think in many ways, when people have an awakening, or a spiritual experience in general, there is a negation of what came before. Absolutely, because what happens in those moments of conscious awareness is that you are experiencing a window or a glimpse of something that you have never previously experienced. And therefore, yes, you do step into another dimension of sorts. But what I've learned over the process of my kind of transformation over the last decade or two is the importance, the complete importance of not leaving yourself behind. And you see that when a lot of people have transformative experiences, they become a totally different person. And I feel that is so dangerous, not just, spiritually, but psychologically, emotionally, because you, like I said, you leave yourself behind, and you can't jump into a new body or a new persona just overnight. There has to be what happens is that you jump into a new window of experience, and then you have to pull back and rejoin your kind of identity as it was before the experience, and then you kind of play this back and forth. There's this dance or tug of war between the two different parts of you, which are now kind of moving and integrating towards a new transformed you.
Amazing. And not to bring in too much Torah right now, I know we're going to speak about it more, but of course the original spiritual journey was that of Abraham, and that commandment was go to yourself. It doesn't mean run away from who you are. It means go towards who you are. So I think that's incredibly affirming. I would say that there was a very similar path that I took. It was a little bit later than you. I went straight into my university days, pretty much a half atheist, half buying into that illusion, as you said, kind of almost fooling myself into thinking that really was where I wanted to go. I had a good Ivy League university experience, and I was really trying to position myself coming from a high school where the definition of success was that you were going to make more money than your parents. And it wasn't until I started interacting with people who were not from my sphere that I grew up in. I grew up in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and I started hanging out with kids from California and all over the world. And that's really where I kind of got another perspective that, hold on a second, you mean there is something else than these 4 jobs that everyone you know has? Well, then I started kind of looking into it. And like you, not growing up in a religious framework, I looked outside anywhere for where I could find. I didn't even know what the answers were. I didn't even know that there was really a question. But when I stumbled upon it, I knew what the question was, and then all of a sudden I knew that there was somewhere to go with that question. For me, it was looking into Eastern spirituality and Eastern religion in order to find answers to that question. But ultimately, for a long time, I felt like I had to kind of leave the world, almost literally. I got to the point where when I was 22 and I was about to graduate, I asked for my graduation present to be a rucksack, a big hiker's pack. I was going to leave the country. I almost literally sold all of my clothes, right? Mm-hmm. All of my nice jumpers and all of my nice, right? I was like, whatever's functional, I'll keep my hooded sweatshirt, but that's basically it. Fortunately, I didn't throw everything away, and I was able to gather what I still had and take that with me, exactly as we said. And so what it became was a process more of integration and saying, well, hold on a second. The superficiality, you're right, taken by itself is very superficial. It's meaningless. But when it's integrated with something deeper, something more internal, then all of those things take on a newer meaning. So much so that, your clothing can be important. It can be an incredibly beautiful thing. Your job can be an instrument of holiness, and your relationships as well.
Well, I think that, you've touched on something very, very important. And actually something that brings us towards what I would say the more Jewish philosophical or spiritual approach. And that's an approach to worldly possessions. There's a radically different viewpoint from the Jewish tradition, as I understand it, to say the Buddhist tradition in that regard, in terms of how do you relate to the worldly possessions around you? What is the world? What does it represent? Does it have meaning, or is it nothingness? And how does that relate to you and your inner world? And I think something that I found profound about the Jewish experience was the value and importance that it places in everything that we own, everything that we possess, not as an inherent value in and of itself, meaning that it's good to possess lots of things and you should amass lots of possessions. That's not what it means. But anything that you happen to have, anything you happen to have been blessed with, whether it was a great fortune or just the clothes on your back, that has intrinsic meaning to what you're supposed to be doing with it right now in this very moment. And that's a radically different view, because it means that the possessions that we have and the faculties that we possess even are things that help us on our mission. They're not just things that we have, they're things that we can, in a sense, infuse with meaning. They're things that we can actually use to get a deeper connection to ourselves and the godliness within.
Yeah, and there's certainly plenty of sources that suggest that. I mean, within the Torah and within rabbinic literature, there's so much that suggests that you're almost not doing it right spiritually if you're not positively affecting the physical things around you, right? There's this deep teaching that, they teach you the kind of the fairy tale version when you're a young kid, that when Jacob goes to sleep and has that dream about the ladder, so he goes to sleep on a pile of stones, and he wakes up the next morning and the stones have all fused into one. And regardless of whether we take that literally or metaphorically is not important. What the important part is that there's something that I do inside of myself, internally, spiritually, that now has an effect on something as physical as mineral life. The very lowest of physicality, which is a stone, can be affected by something that I do. And I think that that's something that as Jews you see it very clearly, because we seek to improve the world around us and not run away from it, I think, on the whole, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Obviously, we can't make generalizations about everybody, but certainly that is the kind of the underlying theme and philosophy of what it means to be a Jewish and spiritual person. Now, let's kind of deconstruct a little bit what it means to have a spiritual experience, because I think you and I both, you mentioned it as waking up, and I said kind of a moment of clarity, and I really do feel that. I think that there was a moment of clarity, but could we describe what that means? I mean, there are studies that suggest that more than 60% of people report having had some sort of spiritual experience, whatever that might mean. But can we put that into words? What does that mean?
I think it's a very difficult thing to put into words, and anyone who has had a profound spiritual experience would be able to resonate with that. And the reason is because words are quite limiting. Even though they're expressive, they're limiting in their ability to define exactly what it is that we're going through. However, there are clues. Certainly the experience of something that is transcendent, even using the words indescribable already gives you a bit of a sense of the experience that's taking place. Right. Now, certainly for, at least in my experience, the experiences that I had were ones of expansiveness, of a sense of being able to sense and experience something which is, I guess what you would call not normal, right. Not part of your everyday, day in, day out schedule of experiences, but something that takes you beyond. Yeah. But the beauty is that although you're transported, so to speak, to a different dimension, you're still part of whatever dimension that you kind of usually find yourself in. So you're kind of like taken out. It's a bit like an out-of-body experience. In the out-of-body experience.
Right, so in case you haven't had a spiritual experience, at least you can relate to the out-of-body experience. So let's relate it to that.
100%. I mean, listen, the out-of-body experience is an experience that, it takes you out of your normal perception of yourself and the world. Right. People who have had out-of-body experiences can report that they have a sense of something beyond, while still being able to so to speak look down over their body. So there's right. There's a cognizant sense of self. I don't know. I would say that is kind of the best way to describe an experience of that sort. Yeah. What would you say?
Well, I try to find analogies for it, and one thing that I hear over and over again that sometimes people use is trying to describe color to a person who's blind. Or, for example, there's some unbelievable videos on YouTube that you can find of people who have cochlear implants, people who've never been able to hear in their lives. Yeah, it's beautiful. And then they're sitting there and they put the thing in, and whoever's sitting there with them, and they say, "Can you hear me?" And the person just breaks down crying, because they don't know what sound is until that moment. Mm-hmm. So in terms of being able to access another sense, that's one way of... But of course, it fails a little bit, that analogy. Because it's not just a question of, well, you've always seen people's lips moving and now you hear this sound that's coming out of there. I think there's something that affects you much more internally. And it's something that you were saying. And there's a sense... the way that I would almost put it is... I like the word expansiveness that you used. For me, it was a sense that my limited self actually has fewer borders than I previously thought. And there's a relationship outside of myself that I can actually tangibly feel and connect to. And that you can extrapolate out and say, well, if I can tangibly connect to the couch that I'm sitting on and the person that I'm looking at, well, then maybe there's actually a way of connecting to everything. Mm-hmm. And that for me was what really captured that moment of clarity, was to say, oh my gosh, I think that there's a unity underlying everything. And a sense of that unity for me was how I would try to describe that spiritual experience.
That's beautiful. That's a really beautiful way of putting it. And really what you're saying, I think, is expanding your sense of self. Right? Usually we have our sense of self is I am my body and my speech and my thoughts and whatever it is that I do in the world. But once you start to expand your sense of self, then your whole consciousness kind of jumps to another place. And it's interesting that you said that your first experience like that was when you went out and you met people who were different from you. And I think that that's a really key element. You know, I had it when I went out and traveled the world and I went to cultures that were not familiar. And what you do when you're in those situations is that you have to expand your sense of self. There's a humility that has to happen because I'm not in my place and there's different people here.
Right.
And that humility is a very important kind of cog in this whole process, because it allows you to understand that there's something greater than you, or something outside you. And then the second stage is to kind of integrate that greater expansiveness into you.
Right. The humility also, I think, helps because at a certain point, there's a part of you that you have to let go of. I think people are, in general, very afraid to change themselves and the basic things about them. And at a certain point in everybody's life, they're confronted with something that challenges them to reconsider their identity. And if you hold on to that identity at all costs, then you lose out on the metamorphosis. You don't grow into that greater identity that you could be. So,
well, identity is key to all of these discussions. And, we mentioned the biblical stories as well. So many of those biblical stories are centered around identity. Abraham and his identity, and he takes on a new identity. He begins this new kind of tradition that leads on to being the Jewish people. And you see that with Jacob. Does he personify Jacob or Israel as his name is changed after he fights with the angel? And then you've got Jacob's eldest firstborn son, Reuben, who has this kind of existential identity crisis about, is he the firstborn? And then that's stripped away from him, and does he belong? And how does that kind of fit into the context of the family in general?
Now, I find that fascinating because I think there are a lot of people, and you see this a lot. You see this all over the place. People who say that religion is almost antithetical to the spiritual experience. And yet you go back to the original religious texts, and they're all describing spiritual experiences. I mean, the things that Abraham encountered, if you read some of the deeper, more Kabbalistic works that tell you of the underlying structure of the Torah. So when Abraham first leaves and then travels through Israel, he's actually encountering higher and higher levels of spiritual experience. I mean, you don't have to imagine very much that when Jacob leaves his home and has the dream of the ladder, that's an unbelievable spiritual experience, and he wakes up and he's fundamentally changed, so much so that the next episode in the Torah is him lifting a rock that 3 men could not have lifted, right? And he does it all by himself. So there are profound spiritual changes that are taking place. Moses in the burning bush, for crying out loud. I mean, these are all moments of awakening. So why is it that people feel like they can't encounter that in religion?
I think the reason that people find this difficult is because, and certainly I had this experience as well, is because you're talking about such an ancient text, something that's so far away that there's this kind of like unspoken understanding that this just can't possibly be relevant to me today in the 21st century. It just can't. And it's written in a biblical language, and even the translations need a translation because it's written in Old English, and
we're now on like the translation of the translation.
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
Yeah.
It's like this is so far away from me. But so I think part of the challenge is to be able to look at those texts. I challenge myself to do this. Look at the text and try and translate it in your own words for the 21st century. Yes, it's a new translation and maybe even a commentary in some regards, but it's totally reframing an ancient, deep, fundamental principle into a relevant modern way. And I think that's beautiful. Now, you talked about the spiritual examples in the Bible, but for me, the way this translates into a relevant modern way of living is, I'll give you an example. The Torah has 613 commandments, right? So we're told that those 613 commandments parallel 613 elements of our physical body, right? Our bones and our limbs and our sinews and all the different parts of our body. And for me, the beauty of that symbolism is that a spiritual connection can take place not just in a spiritual sense, but it's something that relates directly into my physical being. So that means that the actions that I do are not just symbolic of something meaningful, they are an expression of the meaningful teaching. And therefore, I'm not just doing something out of symbolism, but I am imbuing and infusing my body with a sense of spiritual meaning, which is a totally different way of looking at the world. It's not looking at the world in the sense of there's the spirituality which exists outside of me, and there's my physical body which exists inside.
Right.
But rather, those two are totally fused and locked together in a relationship, and my physical actions are an expression of a spiritual meaning.
And I think that also redefines how to look at a mitzvah. And let's take the mitzvahs as an example of where people, I think, get caught up in the religious practice, right? I think we've all been there ourselves, where you go to a service, you go to a shul, you do some sort of religious ritual, and that's kind of what it feels like. It feels like a ritual, right? Why am I eating this matzah, right? Why am I putting these boxes on my head? These things can very easily become rote. They can become divorced of their meaning. And the reason why is because, well, when you start engaging in something physical and something habitual, so then it's so easy to lose that depth. And yet, there's got to be some way of fusing those things together. And I think that's what we're saying, right? You're right. There is something dogmatic about religion in the sense that you do these rituals. Now, if you look at it very childishly, it's like a spell, right? Do this magic trick, say this blessing, and then all of a sudden something's going to change about your food. But that's not the way I think that we're supposed to be looking at it. I think that there is this tension, right? There's a tension between what we do dogmatically, the rituals that we do, the things that pull us into the physical world. And if you go to that extreme, then all you're doing is just actions that have no meaning. You're like a robot, right? On the other side, the other tension is just floating in the spiritual realm, having these incredible, out-of-body experiences, right? These moments of clarity, but you're not really encapsulating it in anything real. I think what the religious, for lack of a better word, dogma, the religious ritual, the symbolism, the symbolic acts of religion, what they do is they pull that spiritual experience down into the physical world so that you're actually infusing something real with what you're doing up in the higher worlds.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And that's a beautiful description of this kind of interplay between the physical and the spiritual. And it made me think a little bit as well, is that, in this day and age, have we become less spiritual? Have we become totally devoid of spiritual meaning? Because in some senses, as the technological age kind of takes over, we have become so materialistic and so infused in every element of our lives. We're bombarded by messages and by ideas and by materialism and consumerism and capitalism and every ism that you could imagine. And in some ways that's detracted from our relationship with spirituality. But has there also been kind of a resurgence in some parts of the world, in some demographics? And
sure.
What do you think?
I think we can both agree that there are certain aspects of humanity that are just taking off in terms of spirituality. I mean, look, the word mindfulness 15 years ago was, nobody knew what that meant, or a very small percentage. And all of a sudden you see it on the cover of Time magazine. What is mindfulness? Well, that's the beginning of a revolution, right? Now, it is interesting to discuss because at the same time you do see that the more we know about technology and also the more we know about human nature takes away some of the wonder and the mystery. I mean, we can now do very clear psychological tests that show us how intuition works, for example, right? And that intuition isn't really intuition, but what it is some higher part of the unconscious brain that's able to process information at a very rapid pace, right? More than the conscious self. Mm-hmm. So then at that point you could say, oh, well, there goes, any sort of higher intuitive thinking that we used to attribute to something spiritual. That's on the one hand. But I think that what that's doing is really that's kind of cleaning out all of the almost pseudo-mystical concepts that we've had until now, right? They call it the God of the gaps, right? Whatever can't be explained, we call it God. But I think there's always been something divine and something spiritual about being itself, humanity itself, the world itself, the wonder of nature. That's not something that's ever going to be empirically reduced to science.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things I think about a lot is how do you quantify a spiritual experience? The whole concept of experience itself is something that is very difficult to kind of reduce to binary zeros and ones.
Right.
And it's something that has color. It's something that has texture. It's something that is expansive, like we said before. So that's something that's very difficult to jot down on a graph or on a table or to measure. But I mean, certainly I think that the advances that we've had in particular in the field of neuroscience have actually helped us to understand ourselves. And what it does is that it maps out, this is the way that the brain works. And I think that, neuroscience as a subject has changed radically over the last 10 years even. I imagine somebody doing a neuroscience degree 20 years ago probably didn't learn anything that they're learning and teaching today.
I wouldn't know. I'm not a neuroscientist.
I'm not a neuroscientist either, but it's something that I've read up a lot about, and I think that what it does is that it actually teaches us that there's a lot more that we still have to learn. But
we still run the risk because people do try to quantify the spiritual experience. They say, well, it releases DMT into your brain, and that's what gives you some sort of hallucinatory effect. And therefore, whatever you think is a spiritual experience is really just some chemical that's acting on your neurons.
Well, it's interesting because DMT, for example, is a chemical that's endogenous to the brain. So it's not something that is only kind of coming in from the outside. DMT is a drug that can be injected into the body. It can be smoked, and it's also something that the brain itself produces at certain experiences in life. Most notably, near-death experiences produces DMT, and other types of experiences give you that sense of hallucinogenic kind of experience. There's a great book by Dr. Rick Strassman called The Spirit Molecule, which he talks about the studies that he did, human studies, using DMT on humans and kind of charting their experiences while being on this drug. And it's a very, very interesting thing. I mean, it's very psychedelic, but he calls it the spirit molecule because, according to his thesis, this drug, whether it's kind of given from the external or with something that the body produces internally, gives people this sense of expansiveness. It transports them into a totally different world.
And there, I think, is where the two kind of meet. Because when people say, oh, it's just DMT being released into the brain and that's what's explaining what happens, well, the answer is, well, that's not explaining what happens. You're just telling me that a certain chemical interacts with your brain. But how to explain that produces the phenomenon that you are experiencing? I mean, there is no chemical, mechanistic description for that experience, for that phenomenological experience, that expansiveness, that oneness. How do we even describe that? How do we know what to call that? And there, I think, is where we can say that the more that we're advancing in the sciences and in the neurosciences, it's not that we're crowding out the spiritual experience. I think what we're actually doing is we're delineating how the two interplay with each other. The more we say, well, this is a function of something physical, and this is the interface with that spiritual experience. So it's the same idea as spirituality and religion coming together, right? There's the high conceptual, ephemeral, phenomenological concept, and then there's the ritual that you put it into. Well, isn't that the same thing as saying, well, I'm having this out-of-body, incredibly exceptional experience of oneness, and there's a certain chemical that kind of brings that on, and that's the seat of that experience. To me, that's almost the same exact thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it could be that they're actually two sides of the same coin in that respect. And one is a description of the other, and yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind when you use those descriptions is this kind of is this concept of the left brain and the right brain. The left brain is the analytical kind of numbers mind, whereas the right brain is this creative, artistic, colorful, textured, experience.
Right.
And the two are not, they don't come to contradict each other in the sense that, one is true and the other is not, but they're two totally different sides of the same coin, which have to kind of find this symbiosis within the skull of each human being, and sometimes we're accessing our analytical mind, and sometimes we have to access our totally out of the box, colorful, crazy mind, and we need both of them. And and I think that when it comes to the realm of experience, we need both. Experience is much more heavy on the right brain element, in the sense that it's something that's very undefined and it's infinite, and it's indescribable, and it's expansive. But when we come back, when we pull out of that experience, we then have to tap into our left brain, into our analytical mind, and evaluate specifically what that experience was. And that's where we have this schism, because we're not able to put into words the experience which is much greater than those words.
Yeah. And what I find most fascinating is the times when one actually creates the other. For example, you see that people get into certain flow states by being so incredibly punctilious in their actions, right? They follow every rule to the T. You see this with actors. You see this with people who play athletics. You see this with people who hone a craft so well that they kind of... It's because of the rules. It's because of the limitations. It's because of how much they've practiced it, and they follow steps A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then in doing that, almost in the space between that, right? There's this self that comes out. There's this unifying whole that comes out of all the little steps of the ritual. And I think that if I were to give advice to somebody that, how can you find spirituality in your practice? How do you find spirituality as a Jew, for example, right? Well, I think what it comes down to is finding the spaces between the actions. The actions themselves bring about that state of being, but you have to be very, very aware of what you're doing. You can't just say abracadabra, hocus pocus, and I've said a blessing, right? There has to be an interaction with the words themselves. Something that's very in the moment and very alive. And once you do that, I'll give you a great analogy, actually, that I came across a long time ago. I sampled a philosophy of science course. And the professor puts on the board Na plus Cl equals NaCl. So he says, okay, right? That's sodium plus chloride equals sodium chloride, which is table salt. He said, look, today we actually have come to a point where we have no idea what Na actually is. Because first we thought it was an atom, and then we thought it's protons and neutrons and electrons, and then you go even deeper and it's quarks. We really actually have no clue what's going on inside of that thing called Na. And also Cl. And we certainly have no clue what NaCl is, right? But we do know something. We know what the plus means, and we know what the equals means. We know what the relationships are between those things, right? And I think that that's kind of where we can find that spirit inside of the ritual, is that we start to plug those things in. We start to build relationships around different actions. And it's in the relationship with that thing that something comes to life.
That's beautiful. I mean, absolutely beautiful. And the relationship, to my mind, the relationship comes from a sense of peace of mind. It comes from an ability to engage in any action, speech, thought, word, whatever interaction, relationship, engaging in a sense of being in the moment, which is, kind of maybe bringing us full circle to the spiritual experience, to mindfulness. And that's, for me, you can't have that relationship. You can't have that sense of total connection without being at peace with yourself in the moment now, right? And for me, I feel like maybe over the last century or 2 centuries, the world was trying to see how far out it could go. We spent millions and millions of dollars trying to send man to the moon and into space, and we have tried to see how far out we can go. And I feel like this generation today is trying to do the same, but on an inward journey. And the greatest journey you could ever take is towards yourself.
Right.
And as far as you can travel out into the universe, you can travel in.
Right, but now there's a new pioneer that's distracting us from that.
Yeah.
Because as far as, the moon and far off continents are, the space of cyberspace is vastly greater. And there's always some new frontier to explore. And that provides endless distraction from being at peace with oneself right now in the moment. So back to your question, which is, today in 2019, are people closer or further away from spirituality? I have to say that today there's far greater potential to be denied that experience because of how much we're distracted by the ability to just play on our cell phone.
I'd push back on that a little bit. While that, of course, is true, it's of course true. There's way more distractions now than ever before. But you ask the average person in any age group, in any country in the world, is this good for me? Is all this social media, is all this stuff? I guarantee, I would estimate that the vast majority, maybe towards 80, 90%, would say, I know it's bad for me, right? So while there is that unprecedented sense of distraction, there's also an underlying and inherent sense of, I know that this is something that I need to be careful with, and I need to use it wisely, and I need to have, the right boundaries with my, relationship with the media, with social media and whatever it might be, because there is a very, very detectable sense of, this is pulling me away from being in the moment and being in the present.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think you're pretty optimistic about humanity, that 90% of people know that social media is bad for them.
Yeah, at least in an elemental level, absolutely. Yeah.
Look, I think I would agree with you that there's a certain point that people get to where they're like, everybody has recognized that moment where they're just scrolling on Facebook, Instagram, whatever it is, for a little too long, and they know that it's pulling them away from reality. But what I'm suggesting is that there's something a little bit deeper, which is that if you go back 150 years ago, it was easy to be alone with yourself in silence. 150 years ago, they didn't have recorded music. You couldn't take any external sounds with you. You just had what you had. And the world was just frankly, a less noisy place. With the exception of the major cities, which are still bustling and busy, but you still didn't have traffic going on at until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. I mean, you had more quiet, and for me, I think that's an essential prerequisite for beginning to access some sort of spiritual experience.
You're right, and I would say that there is definitely, unquestionably, more noise now. But one thing that I think that we didn't really touch on is the fact that throughout human history, there's always been a lot of internal noise. That's something that might be getting noisier as well, but there's always been, yes, you couldn't take a Mozart symphony with you in your pocket 150, 200 years ago.
Well, I'd say the Mozart symphony is actually probably doing a lot to get us closer to that spiritual experience. Unfortunately, most people aren't listening to the Mozart symphony.
Correct. But one thing that people did take on their journeys, even 1,000, 2,000 years ago, is all the noises and distractions that were taking place inside of them, in their inner world, all of their thoughts and their fears and their worries and their anxieties and their troubles and their happiness and all the different elements of their inner world that they took with them everywhere they went. And part of, I think, what we're discussing now about spirituality and mindfulness and being able to attain a sense of peace and inner calm is something that humankind has been grappling with and been evolving for a very long time. And despite the external noise that has increased over the last century or the last generation, the internal noise is one that has happened and continues to happen. And that's why, for all the advances that we've had in technology since the Industrial Revolution, there are some things that are still the same. There are some things that we still grapple with. And yes, there's all this distraction, but there's still a very, very strong need for humans to block out the distractions and return to their sense of self, and that's something that hasn't changed at all.
There's absolutely no question about that. Yeah. And it could be, maybe, I would say this as a maybe. It could be that there's a great teaching that says that we can only really appreciate things except through contrast. Contrast is really what helps us to appreciate something. It could be that the more noise there is, that in the moment that it's all taken away, the silence is even more noticeable. Mm-hmm. And I definitely feel that I've had moments where, coming back to New York City every now and then, it would be Friday night and I'm coming home from the synagogue, and all around me is Friday night in Manhattan. And everyone's out at the bars and having a good time, and there's noise and there's music. And I'm like in my own bubble, because I'm like, well, for me it's Shabbat. And the contrast is unreal. It's unbelievable. In a very strange way, I've almost never felt Shabbat more powerfully than in those moments. So possibly you could say that we get to a point where your life is so filled with noise that the moment that you turn everything off, it almost gets you there almost immediately.
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny that you say that and mention New York. I had one of my most profound spiritual experiences, I would say, in Times Square, where I was sitting there on the steps, and there was just so much going on. I'm born and raised in London, so it's not exactly like a field in the middle of nowhere, but New York is just like another level in terms of the lights and the noise and the sound and the people, and I was sitting there and I was just like totally just I guess overwhelmed by the stimulants that were happening, all the stimuli, all the sounds and noise, and there was just so many people, and I switched into I don't know, it felt like when you tap into like a higher level of your consciousness, and all of a sudden it was as though like there was a mute button that was pressed on everything, and I was just observing everything. I felt a very, very powerful sense of being in the moment, even within that distraction. And that's why I would say that although the contrast that you mentioned is a very important element in identifying the experience, there's also an ability to be able to have the experience within all the noise, within all the distraction, and within all the craziness. And that's what I think is very practical, because most people can't just switch off their lives at the flick of a switch. You can't, a lot of people can't even take half an hour out of their day to go and meditate or to go and think about life or just to chill out. So it's about having those moments, and then having a reference point to take those moments into your work day, to take them into the craziness that, so that you are still connected to yourself and your inner sense of awareness while you're surrounded by the distraction. Now that's not an easy thing to do, and not something that I've mastered.
Level.
But it is a practical and beautiful way to be able to still feel connected to yourself.
Yes.
While you're going through your day-to-day job.
But I think it's that. I think it's the reference point that a person has to begin with.
Absolutely.
I don't think that a person can venture out into Times Square unless they've solidly tied their rope to some anchor in the middle of themselves, and then can safely explore the space. And for me, in terms of practicality, I think that that's probably the greatest advice that I would give to somebody is, if you invest in yourself for a small amount of time, but enough time to get yourself into a different state. And for some people, that might take 10 minutes, for some people 20 minutes, for some people an hour. And it could be that it's well worth the investment one day a week to do an hour of contemplation, going into the woods, I don't know, the Headspace app, whatever it is that gets you there. I don't know. Look, personally, for me, Shabbat, 24 hours of that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not obviously doing that 24 hours because a lot of it's, hanging out and singing songs with my kids and my wife. But even that, within that, there is a reference point, a moment of, I've just reconnected with myself. And now that I've tied that anchor to the self, to that 0-0 axis, now I can venture out for the rest of the week. And it could be that I may only need 2.5 minutes on the train into work to get myself back to that. Could be, during my coffee break, I'm coming back to that point. You now have something to come back to. And of course, like you said, that's what allows you to integrate the job and the family and the commute all into that reference point.
Absolutely. I mean, we all need that reference point. And, it's about, for us, we have Shabbat, that's the obvious place. But, like you alluded to, there's almost a need to do that every day, in a sense, even if you can just steal a few minutes here or there, or you're traveling to or from work, instead of just always being in the swipe right, swipe left, scroll up, scroll down frame of mind, just to be like, okay, I'm gonna do that. I had this experience the other day when I was taking the train home and my phone ran out of battery when I was in the middle of doing something.
Oh, what a blessing.
Yeah. And at first I was, that agitated feeling of I was about to look at something or read something or listen to something, and I can't do that anymore. But then I was just like, maybe there's a higher force at work here. Let's switch off for a moment. Let's switch off and let my kind of inner being switch on for a moment. And it only lasted 5 minutes because I got to my train stop. But yeah, it gave me a sense of when you take a deep breath and you're just like, now I'm ready. I'm ready for the next challenge.
Well, I think that is some amazing advice to end off with, I think. So what do I say? Switch off the podcast now in your commute. Spend the next 2, 3, 5 minutes getting back to yourself. But seriously, I think that there's been a lot of exploration here in terms of our own journeys, as well as defining the spiritual experience. And of course, that's something that's an ongoing discussion. Getting into where the realms of technology, science, and spirituality and the spirit, and how those interplay off each other, as well as understanding where religion and spirituality interplay off each other. And then finally getting into kind of our day-to-day and how we return to that point, that center space, that internal space. I think that we really hit on some very, very important points for the 21st century for an average human being in 2019 in your swipe right, swipe left type of society. There's still always going to be that ability to come back to the self and call it the spiritual experience, call it whatever you want. But I think if you've experienced it, then you'll know.
Absolutely. It's been really great talking to you, Moshe.
It's been an unbelievable pleasure. Hope you enjoyed listening. We'll hopefully catch you next time.